And here we are for a new educational chess game. I have white and I will start with the king pawn. I play e4. My opponent plays c5, the Sicilian defense. I'm going to play knight f3 to support the d4 push. That's the move I usually play. My opponent plays d6 and now I go for the move d4. And in case of a capture, the usual recapture, as you know, is to take back with the knight. But I personally like to play the variation called check over or Hungarian, which involves recapturing with the queen. Why? Because if the opponent plays knight f6 to attack the pawn on d4, the queen is already defending the pawn. I won't need to play nc3. And so I could insert the move c4 before playing nc3. And when you insert the move c4 and combine it with the pawn on d4, you create the pawn structure known as the Maróczy Bind. And this is a very interesting pawn structure against the Sicilian defense, because as you can see, I have this semi-open d file. My opponent has the semi-open c file. But by playing c4, I reduce the space on my opponent's file. And I clamp down on the d5 square so that it's difficult for him to achieve the d5 push. So he plays knight d6, of course, gaining a tempo on my queen. That's the problem with having exposed my queen, of course. So I have to retreat. I don't really know where to retreat, actually. It's not easy to find the best squares. I think I'll retreat to d2. In d3, I will block the bishop f1. On d2, I bother the bishop c1, but maybe the bishop c1. I'm going to try to put it on this black diagonal with b3. kc3, fb2, so nf6 attacks the e4 pawn. kc3 defends, that's normal. My opponent plays g6. So if I play b3 and he plays fg7, I play fb2, and then he'll play kf4. But I could take back because after fb2, my queen is defending. So it'll be fine. He just did kingside castling, so I'm going to have to develop my bishop to do kingside castling as well. But I'm going to calculate the consequences of queen a5, because queen a5 is a move that we see very often in this position. Will there be a problem with queen a5, for example, if I play bishop e2 and he plays queen a5, kingside castling? Can he take on e4? I can recapture. He trades the queens, and after I lose the bishop on b2. So on bishop e2, queen a5, maybe rook d1. Knight takes e4, knight takes. And if he trades the queens, I can recapture with the rook and defend the bishop. Let's play bishop e2 then. So I need to make sure, of course, to defend the pawn on e4. Sometimes you play knight d4 and f3 to reinforce the pawn on e4. And I'll have to fight against the b5 and d5 pushes, which are my opponent's freeing levers. I need to get him to play on 3 ranks while I play on 4 ranks to have a space advantage. And then, of course, I'll need to find ways to make progress. My opponent plays king g4. What is he threatening? He frees the bishop on the black square, but I don't see the threat. Maybe he just wants to redirect his knight to a5, actually, because I don't see any direct threat here, so I'll kingside castling. Bishop h6. I hadn't seen that. I hadn't imagined that kg4 was played in order to get bishop h6, but actually not at all. So if I come to d3, he will definitely put his knights on e5. On c2 it's possible, but I don't really like putting my queen on an opponent's semi-open file. That is, when he plays bishop d7 and rook c8, he could look for the b5 break with the rook and queen facing each other, which could turn against me. It takes time, of course, but... And also, after queen c2, you also have to watch out for moves like knight b4. Maybe just that, simply. Queen d1, actually. I'll play queen d1 cautiously. Well, it doesn't help connect the rooks, but after all, my opponent is also far from connecting his rooks. As for his knight g4, we can push it back with h3 or play knight d4. By the way, to free the queen and the bishop for the attack on the pawn on g4. He plays bishop e6, and here I'm thinking about knight d4. I'm attacking the bishop on the white square, I'm attacking the knight. I think we'll play it this way. He takes on d4. So now I need to decide which one to take. Should I take his knight on d4 or his knight on g4? Because actually, I can take both here. I really don't know how to recapture here. Well, I'll recapture with the queen on d4 after all. I'm pairing my queen with the bishop along this diagonal, just in case. Well, he can immediately contest the diagonal again by playing bishop g7, and I'll put my queen on d2. Let's see if he wants to put his bishop back on h6, in which case I would probably make a different decision now, so as not to repeat moves. My opponent plays rook c8 and lets me take the bishop on the white square. He'll have the pair of bishops. On the other hand, his bishop on the white square, for example, if I play f3, will still have trouble being effective. Well, I think I'll take his knight and play knight to d5, the knight on the outpost, and I offer the exchange of the bishops on the dark square. We'll play bishop takes g4, then place the knight on the outpost and offer the exchange of the bishops on the dark square to break up his pair of bishops and take away his bishop, which in any case is too valuable in this position. Knight to d5. If he plays a move like a 6, I'll take his bishop on the dark square and then deliver a check along the diagonal. Maybe to d4. So here an imbalance has been created because I have two minor pieces to play on the dark square. And now the exchange of the bishops on the dark square breaks up his pair of bishops, and I have a minor piece to play on the dark square, while he doesn't have any. So I need to focus my play on the dark squares. And that's why the knight on d5, which is bothering the pawn on e7, is interesting, because I want that pawn to move forward so I can get the f6 square. But obviously he's not going to do it. But if he doesn't, he's forced to keep the pawn on e7, and so the queen has to stay on d8 to defend it. He probably should have come back to e6 to eliminate my knight like this, because the knight is going to be very annoying for him. That being said, how do I proceed here? He's going for the breakthrough. b5. I don't really need the rooks on the board. I can place my rooks on c1 and on b5, take to exchange some rooks. For example, if I play rook a1, he plays b5, I take. If he recaptures with the bishop, I take his rook. And after the queen recaptures, knight takes e7, the royal fork. Maybe we'll play it like that. Still this pressure on e7, you see, it's going to be interesting. That's really going to make his life miserable. This pressure on e7, the knight on the outpost, what is that? It's the last square located on a semi-open file usable for a knight. That's what we call an outpost. The d file is semi-open. It's only open for me. So I put a knight on d5, and if I play e6, it weakens the square f6, but it will also weaken the protection of the pawn d6. So he plays rook e8 precisely to give his queen more freedom of movement. All right, well, let's put my rook on e1. Let's put it on a black square. I'm going to avoid the white squares. I'm going to avoid any contact with his bishop on white squares along the diagonals. So I put my pieces on a black square, except for my knight, of course. It's here on the outpost at d5 on a white square. And it's true that the opponent might try to eliminate it with his white square bishop. But in that case, I would recapture with the e-pawn to open the e-file and attack the backward pawn on the 7th. And if there's an advance to f5, there will be the en passant. If I need to make a little escape square for my king, I have to make an escape square. On a black square, for example, h3. Because if I play g3, in the end, I give him entry points with his white square bishop. h3, sometimes there can be sacrifices, but it's not easy for him to pull off those sacrifices. Because right now he still has pieces that are very confined in a small space. You can clearly see the space advantage thanks to the pawn on e4 and c4, thanks to this Maróczy Bind. As a little anecdote, it was Géza Maróczy, the great Hungarian grandmaster, who theorized and popularized this pawn structure, even though he was initially a victim of it himself. Well, victim, it was his opponent with the white who played it against him. That against the Sicilian Defense. And Maróczy still won the game with black, but he found this structure very interesting. He saw all the potential in it, and afterwards he adopted it himself with white and really popularized it. So, bishop. c6 has just been played. And here either I move my knight so as not to allow him to exchange the bishop for the knight, or I wait for him to take so I can recapture with the e-pawn and attack the backward pawn on e7. For example, I can play rook to e3 to prepare for bringing the other rook to e1. The problem is that I'm also exposed to the b5 pawn break. But after the captures, I can also double the rooks on the c-file if needed. Alright, I'll play rook to e3. That way I can double up either on the c-file or on the e-file, depending on whether the c-file or the e-file opens up. Note that since he no longer has the bishop on d7, the h3 square is no longer controlled. And sometimes you can have rook transfers to h3. Rook to h3, for example, queen to d2, and queen to h6 with an attack on the h-file. But b5, there it is, has been played. Well, let's go for it. Let's play b5. The capture on b5 and then rook c3 afterwards. We're doubling up on the file, so now he can't take the knight anymore because he would lose the rook. So he might retreat to d7 or b7. With this 2 versus 1 majority, I can also try to create a passed pawn. So he just played bishop b7. What happens if we exchange pieces? Maybe not much. Rook takes, he recaptures with the bishop, and I don't really have any follow-up. I'm still going to give my king a little escape square. For my king, I think. Now I'm hesitating between h3 and h4 because after all, with h4 I can play h5. And if he doesn't take h6 and have some little ideas on g7, you see. With h4, of course, he can play h5 afterwards to block. All right, let's try to be aggressive. Let's play h4. Of course, if the pawns on 6 attack the pawn on h4, there are always ideas of knight to f6. Check. I take the rook and then knight to f6 check. With the queen defending. All right, I'm going to play queen to d2 here. Why? To come to g5. To put a bit more pressure on the pawn on 7. Maybe I should have played a 4. Try to create the passed pawn to give him an extra problem. So he takes on d5, but here, rook takes rook. What did he see? Queen takes... and he loses his piece there. You see, he noticed I was low on time, so he started playing very quickly. So it's true that this is a 15-minute game without increment, but here he played too fast by taking on d5 and just resigned. He just made a blunder. Let's analyze it because it's still interesting. So I have 90% accuracy compared to 74 for my opponent, but I missed a winning sequence at the end of the game, so I'm going to show it to you. So e4, c5, the Sicilian, kf3, d6, I play d4, and here I recapture with the queen. You know, now it's the Hungarian variation or the check over variation. There are 2 names. Here, black player 6. If they play knight c6, immediately we come in with bishop b5 to pin. They play a 6 to avoid the pin, and now I play c4. And you see, if my opponent had played knight f6, since the queen defends the pawn, I don't play knight c3, but I play c4. So after a 6 c4, I've set up the Maróczy Bind. Knight c6, that attacks my queen, so I retreat to d2. nf6, that attacks my pawn, nc3. He puts the bishop in the dragon, that is fianchettoed, on the longest dark diagonal of the board. I do the same to counter him. Kingside castling, bishop to e2, and then he plays knight g4. I'm not really sure why he played that move. By the way, the computer says it's a somewhat dubious move. It doesn't really lead to much. According to the computer, it would have been better to develop the bishop to g4. Of course, that's understandable. But he played it knight g4, so I did kingside castling, and then bishop h6. I was very surprised by this queen attack. Queen d1. He puts his bishop on e6. The knight on d4, that attacks quite a few things. So the computer tells me that this is also a dubious move. It preferred that I play h3. Without really knowing why, I actually like playing knight to d4. But it thinks that h3 would have given a better sequence. My opponent took queen recaptures, he put his bishop on g7. The queen retreats to d2, he puts the rook on the file. I exchange on g4 and place the knight on the outpost. That forces the exchange of the bishops. That way there's no longer a pair of bishops facing me. And now, I thought he was going to play f6, but he comes back to d7, so I place my rook on c1. The computer tells me that rook to c1 is a dubious move. It preferred the move of 4. It's true that it's interesting. With a 4, if the opponent plays b5, the b5 break, you can exchange once and keep the a pawn to push to a 5. And you have a very interesting passed pawn, supported by the rook. Moreover, the pawn can give the b6 square, sometimes to the knight. But I played rook c1. My opponent played rook e8 to relieve the queen from protecting the pawn e7. Let's remember that if the pawn advances, it leads to this. Knight f6 check, protected by the queen. So it's devastating for black. I play rook e1, he plays bishop. c6, rook e3 to be ready to double up. either on the c file or on the e file, depending on his decisions. If he plays b5, I'll double up on the c file. And if he takes my knight, I'll recapture with the e pawn and double up on the e file. He plays b5. Capture on b5 here. The computer says he should have eliminated the knight, but he recaptures with the pawn on b5, so rook c3. And now he can't take my knight because of rook p. A mistake he will make later on, and he plays bishop b7. And here I took a long time to play h4, telling myself that it gives my king a little escape square. Sometimes I can threaten h5 if he doesn't take on h6 with a pawn near his king. Threats of qg7 mate if my rook moves. I thought that's not bad. It's interesting. So I play h4, but I missed a sequence. And believe it or not, I actually calculated it. But I didn't see the key point. And you, what would you do in this position? I invite you to pause the video to calmly look for the answer. So what would you have played? Well, you had to take the rook once. And I looked at that capture. I looked at the capture on the rook because it forces the bishop to recapture. And then I looked at the move knight to c7, which attacks the rook. But I told myself, the rook moves and I have nothing. But my attention has been focused for a while now on the c file, in the center, and on the king side. And at no point did I see in my calculations that I was attacking the pawn on b5. So knight to c7 creates the fork. He has to save his rook and he loses the pawn on b5. And afterwards, I have two connected passed pawns that will only want to rush forward to advance towards promotion. So it's completely winning for me. But you see, in the sequence, I saw it clearly. Rook takes bishop, takes knight c7, he moves the rook. But I'm only looking at the right side of the board. I'm not looking at the left side at all. I played h4 and he makes a mistake by playing h5 because he also needs to solve his problem. Maybe by exchanging the rooks. But he plays h5, so he still gives me the possibility to do rook takes, bishop takes, and knight to c7. But since I don't see the idea of capturing on b5, I don't play it. I play queen to d2 with the idea of coming to g5, doubling the attacks on the pawn on e7. But obviously, I should have taken the rook and played knight to c7. And here, my opponent cracks, he plays bishop, takes knight. Whereas earlier, he understood that he couldn't do it because of rook takes rook. Now he does it. So what should he have played? He should have taken the rook first. I take back. Then take the knight, so I recapture with the queen. And in this position, the computer, you see, gives equality. A strict equality. But for me, in my mind, this position, I was actually very happy to play it. Because I already have the rook on the file. I think my rook is better placed than his. I think my queen is more centralized than his. His pawn on b5 is attacked. I have a majority of 2 pawns against 1. On the queen side, so even if I don't win his pawn on b5, but if I manage to play a 4, the exchanges will give me a distant passed pawn. So I was very happy with this position in reality. So if he had played correctly, he would have reached this position which, according to the computer, is completely equal. Look, the evaluation bar is really in the middle, but I still prefer white. I don't know why it's so equal, but I think from a human perspective, it's interesting to play this position with white. I hope the video has been instructive on this strategy and the structure of the Maróczy Bind against the Sicilian Defense. We will meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboard. Leave me thumbs, comments, share the video, support the channel. Goodbye, everyone.